Right, well, thanks everyone for joining on a Friday night. We're going to go through training zones and training types tonight. So if you're expecting something else, that's basically going to be the topic of this evening's discussion. If you do have any questions, make sure to throw them into the chat function and I'll try and answer as many of them as I go along. But if you make sure, obviously, just to keep that mute off, and I will try and get through as many of the questions as I can. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Ross Hamilton and I'm a physiologist and strength and conditioning coach. I am a former international sailor and have campaigned for London 2012 Olympic Games and Rio as well. And I have transitioned to triathlon, where I've had some reasonably decent success with a bronze medal at the Middle Distance European Championships and also a win with the Men's National Series. I have done a huge amount of coaching from a lot of sports and a lot of different athletes from different levels, as I was the performance manager with Trinity College Sports. So I managed the elite sports unit there. So I have a lot of experience working with different athletes of different types, and I've also been an athlete myself. So that's all the spiel about me. Obviously, we're going to go through training zones and training types. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off just by going through a little bit of an introduction to training zones, and then I'm going to go into a little bit of science around training zones. Now, the science might seem a little bit overwhelming at first and might seem a little bit boring, but it does really give you a good perspective on how training zones work, and it can sort of open up, I suppose, just a new perspective on things, really tie a lot of things together so you can get the most out of them. They're not quite as simple and they're not quite as complicated as people think. So I'll try and get through the science bit relatively quickly and get through the boring stuff pretty fast. But if you do have any questions, like I said, just drop them into that chat window and I'll get through as many of them as I can as we go along. And there'll be plenty of time at the end for a little bit of a discussion. So why use training zones? Well, quite simply, training zones allow you to put a huge amount of structure on your training. So firstly, when you set out your training zones, it will give you a personal profile. So it'll show you your strengths, it'll show you your weaknesses, and that'll generally give you a pretty good idea of where you need to go with your training. And it'll sort of highlight the areas which are going to give you the best return for your efforts. So a lot of the time, if you're kind of training just by feel, you can spend a huge amount of time doing things that aren't really working on your weak areas. And while you might be relatively lucky and see some progress, it's very hard to control that progress. It's very hard to target it. So if you are going to be putting time into training and you're going to be putting your effort in, day out, it is good to be able to know what you're trying to work on. And if you're doing that and you have been doing that consistently, then you have these wonderful tracking points where you can actually look at your performance and see how it's shifted over time. And that will show you what training is working for you. And it'll also show you what training isn't working for you. Some people respond to certain types of training a lot better than to others. So it is very nice to be able to track what is happening in your body. And it's also very nice to look at it across a time scale, because you can start to learn what's effective and learn what you can sort of take advantage of. And it'll also show you where you need to move on from training. So if your training is working, it'll tend to sort of show you what the next thing you need to work on is. So what exactly are training zones? Well, training zones are actually just a grouping of physiological processes, usually defined by some sort of metric. So most of you will be familiar with some of these straight away. Like heart rate is a pretty common one if you're using a watch. You've got pace, power, perceived exertion, and then a lot of people have heard of VO2 uptake. But some of these are really quite simple, in terms of pace, minutes per mile, minutes per kilometer. They're something that are very, very straightforward, but they are things that can really help us define the different groupings of processes that are going on. And when we can define them, then we can track them and we can have that level of control that you wouldn't otherwise have. So why do we need to know training zones? Well, basically, when we're training, it all comes down to energy demand and energy supply. So there's basically three energy systems which will supply the energy that we need to move. So this is the energy that's produced in the muscle to actually cause a contraction and get us moving. And it's which energy system we actually use is determined by the amount and rate of energy that's needed. So obviously, if you have a really big sprint or a really high power output, you're going to need energy very, very quickly. It's going to be short burst and it needs a very fast supply in a large amount. Whereas if you have a nice, steady, controlled, slow effort, you can have a much slower supply and it can come at a much more gradual rate. Now, a lot of the time, what determines which of these energy systems is best is the actual store available and the oxygen supply available to us. So we're never using one energy system on its own. We're usually using a sort of a mix of all three, but the one that takes over is usually the one that's most effective for the job you're trying to do. The first system is one that you've probably heard of a huge amount. It's the aerobic system. So it's obviously a major contribution of energy through aerobic metabolism, which usually means in the presence of oxygen. There's usually a pretty good fuel mix, so you'll burn both fat and carbohydrate. The type of muscles that are typically aerobic in nature are quite fatigue resistant because they're quite small muscles. They tend to have slightly lower power outputs, but they will contract repeatedly over time quite well without running out of energy because they have a nice, long, slow supply of energy. So they're suitable for longer durations, but they will have a limit in terms of the amount of power output they can produce because, as I said, they're small muscle units. Second system is the anaerobic system. So most of the energy that you will get in the anaerobic system will come from glycolysis. So carbohydrate is the main fuel, and that comes in either the form of glucose in the blood or glycogen in the muscle, which is freed up into glucose in the blood. When you burn carbohydrate, you will produce lactate and hydrogen ions. They're just a byproduct of glycolysis. So it's not necessarily a bad thing that lactate is produced. It's going to be produced even at rest because glycolysis is active at rest. The good thing is that lactate can be recycled and used as a fuel through aerobic metabolism. Through a pretty complex shuttling system, it can be recycled essentially and used as a fuel. So the anaerobic system is particularly good for higher efforts or higher power production or pretty fast power production. So with the result, if they need a lot of energy and they need it fast, they're probably going to run out just as quickly. So they're quite fatigable, but they can last a reasonably decent amount of time, somewhere between about a minute to about 90 seconds. I have 10 seconds there because that's sort of when it starts to kick in, because like I said, they do all kind of work together. Our third system is a little bit of a rogue system because it's not really something that's used during a steady state. So the phosphate creatine system uses the creatine phosphate and the ATP, the most basic energy molecule in the muscle, and it will use it instantly. So if you want to sprint or if you want to accelerate, basically you're going to use whatever muscle is in the muscle as you get going. So it's the instant sort of energy output. And it's usually what's going to give you the fastest supply of energy. So this is why it's particularly good for accelerations and when you're sort of starting off. Now it is extremely limited. It's not going to last more than about 10 seconds. So that's why once you get past that sort of 5, 6, 7 seconds, you'll start transitioning into one of the other energy systems and that power output that you have will start to reduce. So using this sort of graphical representation, you've got, if we start down the bottom left, as you move up and to the right, you're basically increasing the intensity. Okay, so you can see how you start to transition as you increase intensity from the aerobic to a bit of a mix to then fully anaerobic. And as I said, because the phosphate system is a little bit rogue, it sort of never really is available during the steady state. It's kind of used when you accelerate off from a very start or take your first steps. But there is small amounts of energy in the muscle that can be burned very, very quickly. But if you want to maintain anything for any length of time, it's going to be either through the aerobic or anaerobic system. So as we increase intensity, we will start to see an increase of breathing rate, heart rate, blood flow, and oxygen uptake to basically meet the demands of those energy demands from your muscle. And eventually you'll reach your heart rate max and your VO2 max, which basically means that there's going to be no more supply to help you produce energy. For those of you familiar with thresholds, the first threshold is met between at the end of the sort of the aerobic only phase, and then goes into when you have a bit of a blend, and then you get the second threshold when you transition into almost fully anaerobic. I'll go through that now in a little bit more detail as we go along. So what metric is going to be best for you? And this is in terms of, you know, are you going to use watts? Are you going to use heart rate? Are you going to use pace, power? It has to be practical and it has to make sense to you. So if you don't understand it or if you don't have access to it, then it's not going to be a really realistic metric. So there's no point in using VO2 max uptake or percentage of VO2 max, because very, very few of us will have access to a mask that's actually going to collect gas exchange. It's pretty, you know, even elite level athletes don't have access to it. It's pretty much only lab based. So realistically, things like heart rate, pace and perception and power are going to be the things we use. Now, what you need to know is what the limitations are on what you're using. So if they're not perfect, you need to know why they're not perfect so that you don't get, I guess, sort of skewed information or biased information that's not particularly accurate because, you know, something was wrong in the day. You need to know what might go wrong with what you're using so that you don't kind of freak out if the numbers aren't what you expect. So it does need to be reliable and consistent. And as long as you're doing that, it doesn't matter a massive amount which one you're using. They all do a job. And as long as you pick the right tool for the job, you're going to be in a reasonable ballpark. So the first metric that you can use is perception. Now, it's highly subjective, it's extremely variable, it can be influenced by a huge amount. A cold, wet morning, and your perception is going to be something entirely different to what it might be on a perfect sunny day. But it can be a real critical piece of information, because if you have decided that you're at your absolute limit, you feel horrific, you're in pain, and you don't want to continue, and you stop your race or you stop your training session, then it's over. It doesn't matter what your power output is or what your pace is. If you've decided that the effort is too much for you on the day, then that's it. It really doesn't matter what your zones are telling you. And, you know, perception can be quite powerful. Some of the best runners in the world have grown up only using perception, and they've become really, really good at it. And they can tell you exactly what race pace is. They can tell you exactly how it feels. And when we take them into a lab, we can actually see that their race effort matches up with exactly what our more scientific structuring of their zones is. But it does require a huge amount of experience. And I have heard quite a lot of athletes come to me and say, you know, I know how my body feels. Well, elite level athletes struggle to know how their body feels because we see them blow up in races on a regular basis. And that's purely just because it can be very, very subjective and very easily influenced on the day. So while it is important and perception is going to be something that you're going to be relying on during a race, it's also got its limitations. Now, heart rate is probably my favorite because it's intrinsic. It's something physiological. Now, it can be influenced. Heat and dehydration can be huge factors in sort of swinging your heart rate out of its normal ranges. It's also got a time lag. So if you're doing anything for, say, under 3 minutes, your heart rate probably isn't going to stabilize. And so it's got some sort of limitations there. It's really best for longer duration efforts where there's a steady effort. So things like intervals can be quite hard to track using heart rate. And it's also subject to something called cardiac drift. So this means that if you're to, say you're on a bike and you're pedaling at a steady state for maybe an hour or two in the heat, your heart rate will gradually rise as the session goes on, largely due to sort of the heat buildup in the body, dehydration, discomfort. There's a lot of different reasons why it might increase, but you would expect to see some increase over the time. So again, when you understand that that increase is relatively normal, you can use it to your advantage. Now, I think heart rate is probably the best reflection of physiological stress. So when you're actually trying to train your physiology, build capacity, and actually improve your fitness, it's physiological stress that you really want the feedback from, not necessarily performance. That can be used in a different way. So heart rate for me is probably my favorite. Power and pace are extrinsic, and they're quite common. Like most runners will probably use pace as something that they use for their training zones. They use pace zones. Now, the problem with power or pace is they can be influenced probably more so with pace. But I mean, if you're running with a tailwind behind you, you can have a fantastic run session that you're not working particularly hard. Turn around and run into the wind, and all of a sudden the same pace becomes extremely difficult. So it can be very, very easily influenced, and it's the same for going uphill or downhill. So it's a little bit tricky to use pace reliably from session to session, and it's quite hard to use it consistently because environmental factors will make a huge difference there. Power is probably a little bit more reliable, but again, the type of power sometimes isn't always the same. For example, if you're climbing, you know, you'll have more power application on pedals throughout the whole revolution, you know, because you're actually sort of working against gravity. But if you're on a flat or going downhill, when you have those sort of little losses or less consistent pressure on the pedals, it's sometimes harder to hold power. But generally speaking, power is probably a little bit more reliable than pace. Now, they are pretty good measures of output. So, you know, if you know what you can actually produce in terms of pace and power, you're going to have a pretty good idea of what your performance expectations need to be. So if you are, you know, running 4 minutes per kilometer, you're not going to set a world record marathon. So, I mean, they do give you a pretty good indication of performance. But again, what some people tend to get or forget is that, you know, if you're running a 4 minute per kilometer in perfect conditions, and all of a sudden it's windy, your expectations on race day have to change. So again, using pace and power for races can be a little bit misleading. And again, you need to know the limitations of that, because if you forget that pace is good or wind is going to slow you down, for example, you could have a very fast or a very intense start to a race that's going to catch up with you later on when you burn out. Then we have physiological measures. Now, these are something that not everyone's going to have access to, but they're probably the best. So they're very much a measure of your body's physiology. And we have things like lactate, we have VO2, we also have breathing rates and a few other things that we can measure. But for most people, they're not entirely practical. Lactate has definitely become a lot more accessible for people, and it's probably the best in terms of grouping those zones for you. So it is worth, if you have access to a lactate test, to get it done, because it can give you some really very good information. And again, they are fantastic indicators of performance. You know, we can generally tell what an elite marathon runner's VO2 is going to be, plus or minus a few mils, because generally speaking, you know, people at that level kind of have the same sort of physiological ability, and then it just kind of comes down to pace and strategy after that. So they are very, very good measures of ability, and they can give you a pretty good idea of what you kind of expect to achieve. So that's kind of the main sort of sciencey portion. And now I'm going to go into showing you kind of how it all comes together a little bit more. So this is a lactate curve, and I'm going to use lactate just because it's just a very nice version of things, and it can display things quite nice and can tie it all together. So in the red, we have blood lactate, and in the blue, we have heart rate. And as you can see there along the bottom, we have load and watts. So this is using an example of a cyclist. So down in the bottom left, you can see they start very easy, and blood lactate is very low. 1 millimole per liter, 1.2. That's the sort of resting levels, because we always have a little bit of glycolysis going on. So we always have a little bit of lactate in the blood. As we progress on, you'll actually see the lactate dip a little bit, because like I said before, it will be consumed as a fuel. So your body will actually start clearing some lactate out. And that's again, quite beneficial, because it's just showing you how efficient your aerobic system is at actually consuming lactate as a fuel. As you move on, you'll see the heart rate starts to climb as you start to produce more effort. As we said before, that's the increase in oxygen demand, trying to meet the increase in energy demand. So supply versus demand, that's pretty much all this is. Eventually, once we get to about 270 watts, or probably more like about 280 there, we're going to see a slight increase from baseline of lactate. Now, what this is starting to show is that the aerobic system is not able to do everything on its own anymore, and we're starting to get a contribution from the anaerobic system. So with this little arrow, you can see that we've started to see the first kind of noticeable rise, 1 millimole of rise between that sort of 280, 300 watt mark. After this point, we're using a blend of both, okay? So the aerobic system will continue to try and clear out lactate, but lactate will keep rising if we keep going harder. If we stop going harder and we just level off and keep the effort the same, it'll stabilize. So we can sit, you know, sort of 3 millimole for quite a while. On happy days, that's generally how we're going to race. But eventually we'll hit a point where we're producing so much lactate because we're trying to produce a lot more power. We're using much bigger muscles, and the aerobic system is no longer able to clear the lactate. And the lactate will start to accumulate in our blood, and the concentrations will rise. When the concentrations rise, it starts to shut down our ability to contract. And this is partially a bit of a sort of a safety mechanism, but it's also down to interference essentially with the muscle's ability to contract. This generally happens around the 4 millimole mark, okay? And what's kind of interesting about the 4 millimole mark is it's generally the highest sustainable output that you can hold for approximately an hour. So you'll see in a lot of texts and articles and things referring to the maximal lactate steady state, that's roughly around the 4 millimole mark. And it is the highest level of intensity which you can sustain for a relatively long period of time. And that period of time is usually defined as about the hour mark. Once you go over 4 millimoles, once you start going harder again, you won't see any stabilization of lactate, and the lactate concentrations will rise exponentially. They will just continue to rise until they shut you down. All along, your heart rate is increasing nice and steady with a nice sort of smooth linear response. And VO2 will look exactly like heart rate there. They have a very, very similar relationship. So, but this is essentially the lactate curve, and this is sort of how your body responds to increase in effort. Once we get that curve, we can actually then very quickly see the different areas of our physiology that we can sort of start working on. And this, if you go to a lab, is generally how they'll put together your training zones. Now, here I'll show you roughly where things sit. They do tend to fluctuate a little bit. This is, I suppose, a typical lactate curve, but some look slightly different shapes. But we can basically see in the recovery zone, we don't have any real shifts of lactate. It's very aerobic. It's a very easy effort. Zone 2, endurance, it's still a very easy effort. There's still no real increase in lactate, but it is starting to get a little bit tougher. Tempo is right after that sort of first shift. And it's when we start to see a little bit of a contribution from anaerobic glycolysis, but it's still mostly aerobic. Then we have this threshold zone. Now, threshold should kind of group a little bit below and a little bit below. So it's about 5% below and about 5% above. I would tend to group threshold work as A and B, A being that little below zone and B being above. I think a lot of the time when you're working just below threshold, you're sort of guaranteeing that you're increasing your aerobic ability. But when you go over threshold, you start working on something slightly different. You start to work on tolerance and your ability to actually cope with lactate and clear lactate, which aren't necessarily the things that you want to work on. For some events, they're absolutely what you want to work on, but others, it depends. And we'll go through that a little bit more as we get a little bit farther into this. Zone 5. Now, I tend to go with 5 zones because I think once you go over zone 4, things start to become a lot less clear and a lot less obvious. You know, it becomes more down to the training session more so than actually anything you're tracking. Heart rate will be pretty much max and you won't see any difference there. Lactate will be extremely high, won't show a huge amount. So, you know, it's very hard to see the difference between 1 minute all out effort versus, 5 by 20 second efforts with very short rest. So once you sort of go over zone 4, you can easily break it down into another 3 or 4 zones, and I'll show you in the next slide. But generally speaking, once you go over zone 4, the session needs to be dictated by the session structure more so than the intensity level, because like I said, it's very hard to actually track intensity when it's so short or so kind of, I suppose, lacking resolution or detail. So this is kind of, it's quite easily found on anywhere on the internet, but it's sort of an idea of how the zones correspond with each other, how the different zone structures correspond. So we have, the FTP type structure, the thresholds based on heart rate, which is what I've just gone through with the lactate curve, RPE, which is the perception based, and then there's even more simple perception based where you're looking at kind of conversation type descriptions. Now I'll go through that a little bit more when we get into zones, so don't worry that we've just kind of skimmed over it. So how to set your zones. You've got a few options on setting your zones. Number 1 is lab testing. It's very accurate, but it's pretty inconvenient. It's hard to get access to. At the moment, there aren't any labs open. You might think it's for the elite sort of level athlete, but actually it's not. It doesn't matter whether you're a complete beginner or an elite. It'll just give you a really, really good level of detail. But like I said, it's costly and it's sort of inconvenient. So it's not necessary, but it's nice to have. Second is field testing. Field testing is pretty good, but you've got a lot more variables involved. If there's wind, rain, and then you're talking about the equipment, handhelds, analyzers, heart rates, they can be a little bit more variable. So the accuracy of your zones isn't going to be quite as good, but it's still an educated guess. So if you are looking for something convenient and fast and you still want to check in with a reasonable amount of detail, field testing is particularly good. And I would do quite a lot of field testing with the athletes I work with because it's a very nice way of checking in to make sure that the training is taking effect and making sure that the zones are accurate. Then we have functional thresholds. These are extremely convenient and very, very, very common now, especially with all of the online platforms and things that people are using nowadays. Functional thresholds testing has become the most popular DIY method. And it's extremely convenient. It's pretty straightforward. Most of the online platforms will actually do all the calculations for you, but it can be extremely misleading because functional thresholds are generally a calculation based off some sort of duration, whatever the test will be. And it doesn't always show you the areas that you need to work on. So, you can work quite hard on a 20-minute average, and you can do all the right training for increasing your sort of 20-minute average, or if you're a runner, it might be, a 5K test. But that doesn't really tell you a huge amount about how you're going to go in an Ironman race or a marathon, because you're working with totally different levels of intensity, which require quite different systems to, actually contribute to the fitness there. So functional threshold, it's definitely useful, but again, there's a lot of limitations to it, and you sort of need to play with it a little bit to make sure that you're getting the right information out of it. Then we have our online calculators, or the calculators in your watch. Again, not bad, but they're just not particularly accurate. How these work are they take the best fit curve of a global average. So you put your weight in, your height in, your age in, and it'll basically plot you on a curve of averages, which is probably going to be about 90% accurate, but that just means that there's actually quite a lot of variance. And more often than not, these are actually not that close. So if you're a complete beginner and you're trying to get something to start off with, this is a good place to start. There's nothing necessarily that wrong with them. And if somebody was a complete beginner that hadn't got any sort of fitness, maybe hasn't done anything in a couple of years, start with the calculators for 3 or 4 weeks and then do a test. Because the chances are, if you do a test on day one, after 2 or 3 weeks, your fitness is going to have shifted so much that the zones aren't necessarily going to be accurate anymore. Then your final option is to do nothing, to use no zones whatsoever and not to test anything. Now, there are plenty of people who will do this. There are plenty of people who will just go out and ride hard or run hard on a regular basis, and will see increases in fitness. But, what you do in training tends not to be all that, a lot of the time it's not all that relevant to the racing. I mean, if you're a runner, you might do 5 and 10K, but you're trying to race a marathon. So if you're constantly trying to do a faster 10K, you might be building a type of fitness that's not particularly suitable to a marathon. So if you do nothing, like I said, you can get lucky. You can definitely improve fitness, but sometimes even if you're improving fitness, it might be the type of fitness that actually hinders the performance in your racing rather than helps. So I certainly don't recommend doing nothing. And I'm hoping because everyone's here, it's because they're not just doing nothing, they're actually using zones. So when we look at the types of tests we can actually use in practical, these are the sort of typical ones. The 1 hour test is probably the best. That's where we get that 4 millimole, that maximal lactate steady state result. And it is very well validated, and it works. But a lot of people don't want to do a 1 hour time trial. A 1 hour max effort is extremely tough mentally, and it can just be a really horrible test to do. So it tends not to be that popular, and it's hard to get people to buy into it. So we've had to go looking for easier ways of finding out these things. So we have things like the 30-minute TT, which is typically what they recommend on a platform like Training Peaks, where you'll just take the average heart rate or average pace, average power for your 30-minute, and you'll call that threshold. Now, that is more than likely going to overestimate things. When we compare that to a lab-based test, which is extremely accurate, 30-minute time trial will usually be quite a large overestimation. I would say with athletes I've worked with, 30-minute time trial is probably about 105% of where their actual threshold is. And that's not a definitive amount. It can be quite a big range. 20-minute time trial is probably the most common test that most people use, especially in the cycling world on the likes of Trainer Road and Zwift and everything else, where you do a 20-minute all-out effort and you take the average and you multiply it by 95%. That is, I've almost never seen that actually match up to someone's threshold. It's nearly always well above their threshold. And I think it's quite a misleading test because there's plenty of people who can push really, really hard and inflate numbers over 20 minutes that would never be able to hold even 95% of that over the hour. And I would say almost all of the athletes I work with would sit more likely between 90 and 95%. I don't think any of them actually make that 95%. Elite level athletes might. Elite level athletes will be able to take that 95% average and sit at it for an hour, but they're also extremely well trained and very, very good at tolerating those hard efforts. Another test that's become quite popular is the 2 by 8 minute time trial. And I apologize, most of these are aimed towards cycling. The 30-minute test or 10K is probably the most appropriate for runners. But this 2 by 8 minute time trial has become really popular as well, again, because it's shorter than the 20-minute, and that little bit of a break in the middle also helps. But again, massively overestimates. We tend to be, as an sort of an Irish nation anyway, most of us have been brought up on team sports, which means we've got pretty decent glycolytic development. And so when it comes to short, hard efforts, we're usually pretty good. We're usually able to tolerate hard efforts. But as we start to extend on, that's usually where we drop off. So I think some of these shorter tests are a little bit suited to our backgrounds. Whereas when you compare to, the sort of the Kenyan runner type, very aerobic and not particularly powerful, they would really, really excel over the long distances, and you'll see no drop off as they go shorter. Finally, then, the ramp test. I know this is probably Trainer Road's most popular test, and it's certainly something that Zwift has started to adopt as well. This is pretty much useless for getting heart rate. I mean, it might give you a relatively decent estimation of your power threshold, but heart rate requires at least 3 to 5 minutes to stabilize in stages, and a ramp test that only gives you a minute won't see any stabilization in heart rate. So you're almost guaranteed to set quite low heart rates and quite high power. So the ramp test, again, decent snapshot of performance, but not particularly good for setting zones, at least not physiological ones anyway. So a little bit more on how to actually do them. These are the calculations. Firstly, if you don't warm up properly beforehand, you can pretty much toss out any results you're going to use. So 1 hour test, take the average heart rate and power. That's going to be pretty accurate. I mean, that's kind of gold standard. 30 minutes, it says to take the average in most calculations, but we know when put down to actually being tested and compared, this isn't accurate. Same with the 20 minutes, same with the 2 by 8. So some of these, while you're probably asking me, well, why am I talking about them if I don't like them? Well, they're actually very good for giving you sort of an idea of your performance. So while you might not be able to get very accurate zones off of them, they will give you a really nice snapshot of your performance. So if you're a time trial cyclist, 20-minute, 30-minute time trial tests are going to be perfect for giving you an idea of where you're at. But if you're a multi-stage cyclist or a GC type rider, then 1 minute power efforts, 5-minute power efforts are going to be important too. So actually profiling your efforts are going to be important. But that, again, they're not going to give you zones. They're just going to give you a snapshot of performance, whereas you can actually get very good information if you use these tests in a slightly different way to a lot of what they're told to use. So as you can see here, there's those little extra classes to a zone. There's the VO2 max, there's the anaerobic and neuromuscular. Again, having spoken about what we've spoken about, you know that there's that lag in heart rate. So you can't really use heart rate to use these zones. In terms of power, you can look at peaks, but you can't really set a target power, because if you're anyway fatigued, neuromuscular efforts, the target powers are going to shift a huge amount day to day. So when it comes to working above threshold, you really do need to start looking at the session structure more so than the actual level of intensity. And you need to try and hit targets rather than hold a specific intensity. But for anything below threshold, you can sit right on your heart rate or power, and it'll be quite effective. So we're going to go into the actual zones now. And everything that I kind of come up with in zones is based off this curve. This is where they sit on your mapping of your intensity, okay? So the recovery zone is our sort of first zone. It sits approximately between 60% and 70% of functional threshold heart rate. Now that functional threshold heart rate, again, is based off whatever the calculations you choose to use, whether you're using 20-minute or 30-minute. Like I said, as long as you're being conservative and not trying to squeeze every little bit out of those tests, they're going to be about 95% accurate. And if you just maybe knock off, let's say, for instance, you do a 20-minute FTP test and it tells you your threshold heart rate is 165, for example, you might just take 2 or 3 beats off that just to be conservative, just to sort of eliminate that overestimation. And as long as you're sitting at the lower end of your ranges, you're not going to run too much risk. It's when you try to push everything and try to work at the ceiling of every single zone that you're working with, that's when you start to have issues. So the recovery zone sits at about 60 to 70% functional threshold. What it does is it increases blood flow, it helps promote ranges without necessarily adding fatigue. So it shouldn't be any way difficult at all. It is simply just getting out and getting moving. And it can be particularly good for athletes who are maybe trying to lose weight, where they're trying to increase their calorie expenditure over the course of a week, but maybe have a huge amount of other training sessions that they can't really sacrifice. So team sports players, this sort of zone is ideal because it sort of pairs nicely with their technical sessions. We're not adding extra fatigue, but we are increasing, a little bit of calorie expenditure. And if you do half an hour in this zone every day in the morning, you're not going to get particularly tired from it, but you could end up burning an extra 1,000 calories in a week, and it can be quite effective for that. So the recovery zone, not necessarily there to build fitness, more to just get the blood moving, get a little bit of heat in the body, and promote ranges and get moving again. Zone 2 is an extremely important zone. So that sits approximately 70 to 83% functional threshold. It's larger aerobic, so it's going to be using oxidation and aerobic metabolism as its main kind of energy supplier. You're going to have to do it for longer durations, and you'll be able to do it for longer durations because the fatigue won't nearly be as high. This is pretty much dictated by fuel. As long as you keep eating and you stay comfortable, until muscle starts breaking down, you can go for quite a long time. So you're talking, hour, 2-3 hours. This is the sort of thing that you'll use in an Ironman race or a large audax type event. And it's brilliant because it actually develops the physiological infrastructure. So our heart basically sort of produces or pumps blood in two kind of ways. It basically, there's a thing called cardiac output, which is a product of the amount of blood pumped per pump and the amount of pumps per minute. So when we're at zone 2, this is when our heart is actually at its most efficient. It's allowed stretch to its fullest capacity and fill with blood. But when we start going more intense, it doesn't get the time to stretch. So our heart rate increases. So when we're sitting in this zone, we're repeatedly getting this really full stretch of the heart. And that's really, really good for making the heart grow and become a lot more efficient. And it's not the same as, it's not growing in terms of its thickness, it's growing in basically the size of its chambers. So per pump, it can pump more blood. And when we go over this intensity, basically it stops getting the time it needs to refill. So we don't get that stretch. And that's why when you go a little bit too hard for your endurance zone, you sort of miss out on some of the really fantastic adaptations that you get. And the heart remodeling is certainly one of those things. In addition, when you get that large volumes of training, you start to see better capillarization and blood flow to muscles. And you also get a lot better at using fuels and more efficient at using fuels because you're now getting a better supply of oxygen and therefore can fully oxidize and get more energy per amount of fuel. So this zone allows you to train for long durations where you get all those nice adaptations. And it's something that's not particularly hard, so you can get that duration, but it's also hard enough that it's going to, take you up to an intensity where things need to happen and it's going to be able to make you stronger. Generally speaking, you should be able to hold a conversation at this intensity. Okay, so if you don't have a heart rate monitor and if you don't have all the fancy tools, you can simply use the speech test as a good indicator of whether you're going too hard. If you can hold a full sentence, you're probably okay. If you're struggling to catch your breath, you're probably going too hard. Okay, so the endurance zone, I have double star there because that is where a very large amount of your training should sit. The tempo zone. Okay, so this is that zone 3, which sort of straddles, it's not quite aerobic, it's not fully anaerobic, it's harder than easy, but it's not quite hard enough. Okay, typical kind of recovery times for efforts in tempo zone, no more than really 3 minutes will do the job. So it's a mix of energy. You're starting to get a lot more contribution of carbohydrates. So lactate starts to become a little bit more present. For that reason, it's going to be a little bit less of a duration because now you're starting to get the fatigue that comes with lactate accumulation. It sort of straddles processes. So you're not quite working aerobically, you're not quite working anaerobically, you're kind of doing a little bit of both. It is actually typically where you'll sit in a race because it's comfortably hard. And it's quite important for pacing, especially long distance events, things like Ironman, marathon, or a particularly long stage race. You're going to be spending a large amount of time in this sort of tempo intensity. So it's not a case of that it's totally useless. And unfortunately, there's quite a lot of zone structures out there that will tell you that zone 3 is useless. I think if anyone's familiar with the 80-20 principle, the Matt Fitzgerald principle. They call this the gray zone. And yes, in a training context, it's probably not going to give the biggest return for your efforts, but there's also a lot of stuff that you need to get used to in tempo. Like if it is going to be your race pace, then this is an effort that you're going to have to spend a reasonable amount of time at to get used to your fueling demands and then comfort, especially if you're a cyclist. If you're going to sit for long periods of time at tempo effort, you need to know how that's going to feel when you're pedaling and how it's going to feel in certain positions. And for a runner as well, you know, in terms of the biomechanical stress, having reasonable durations built up at this intensity is going to help you during racing. So while tempo is definitely not a waste of time, it is something that probably is more relevant to racing than it is for training. It becomes more important once you get closer to your event. Threshold, now we're getting back into something that is very important again, because that threshold is that maximal sustainable effort. And for long duration efforts, yeah, threshold is not going to be quite as important, but for many of us racing shorter events, 5K, sprint triathlon, time trials, threshold is going to be the bread and butter. And even in longer distance events, when you're doing long climbs or hard efforts, threshold is really going to dictate how long those efforts are going to last for. So if you're a cyclist in a stage race, you know, if you're trying to take a bit of a pull off the front or do a breakaway, what you can sustain at threshold is going to dictate how much distance you can put on in that sort of short burst time. As I said before, I like to split it into A and B, you know, 5% below and 5% above, because that sort of helps you select what you're trying to work on. If you're trying to just build your aerobic capacity and drive your threshold up from below, then work a little bit below threshold and make sure that things stay aerobic and it's the aerobic side of things that you're working on. But if you're trying to do something like a time trial and you're trying to teach yourself how to just tolerate that pain and discomfort of working really, really hard, then working just a little bit above threshold is where you want to work, because that's exactly what's going to teach you how to tolerate high levels of lactate and clear it and basically suffer a lot better. And you will see a very good response from that type of training. It happens pretty fast because a lot of it is a chemical change rather than a structural change. So quite typically you'll see people doing a huge amount of threshold work and, you know, efforts above threshold, because it does give you a very quick return for efforts. You will definitely get fit really fast from doing threshold work, but it will only last a couple of weeks because you're upregulating all these chemicals in the body that help you work at that intensity, but you're not really building the structure. You're not enlarging the heart. You're not increasing blood flow. You're just teaching yourself how to tolerate. And that does have a pretty limited amount of adaptation, and it's short-lived. So what you'll see a lot of people doing is they'll do a lot of intensity, a lot of intervals, especially if you've maybe neglected your off-season training, and you'll see a very short but pretty significant increase in fitness and think, Jesus, these sessions are fantastic. I'm going to keep doing these. And then after 2 or 3 weeks, you stop seeing an improvement in fitness and you think, okay, well, I just need to push harder. Now you're running the risk of overtraining and putting too much stress on the body. And realistically, you've just gotten all you can out of the engine you currently have. So this is sort of mapping the engine rather than building it. And that endurance work is where you're really going to build it. So quite often the idea is to spend a lot more time building the engine than tuning it. And while you can always be doing a little bit of threshold work, it should never become the majority of your work. And this is where that 80-20 principle of 80% easy, 20% hard comes from. That 20% is that high intensity work, that threshold work. The 80% is building the engine. It's the aerobic stuff. And basically the aerobic capacity is your floor. So when you need to rest, that's the effort you need to go at to rest. And the higher that is, the better. So threshold work is mostly carbohydrate, which again, if you overdevelop this, if you're an Ironman, for example, or a long stage rider, if you're overly reliant on carbohydrate and particularly good at threshold, you're going to burn through a huge amount of carbohydrate. And it can be very, very hard to get the amount of energy back into your body than what you're burning. And this is where we start to see people hitting the wall in a marathon, where they're pushing hard at threshold. They've become really glycolytic in nature. They're going through huge amounts of fuel, and suddenly they don't have the fuel to continue. And yes, they're taking in their gels. Yes, they're taking on fluids, but it doesn't seem to be working. Why? Because they're burning more than they're taking in, and they may not be taking it in fast enough. So taking a little bit of pressure off your glycolytic system can be quite a beneficial training strategy for longer distance events. For short distance events, it obviously doesn't matter as much. So something like a sprint or a 5K or even a 10K where it's sort of around the hour plus, you know, you can get away with whatever energy stores you have, and you're probably not going to hit the wall in that time. You're just going to be tolerating pain. So these are considered quite high fatigue, because when you're at threshold, you're going to shut down very quickly, either because of lactate starting to get too high or because you're running out of energy. But it is typically that maximal lactate steady state type effort where you're sort of around that 4 millimole type concentration of lactate. Short race pace, and it sort of, like I said, dictates those short pushes. If you're using the talk test, really, you're just getting single words out. How are you feeling? Okay, fine, stop talking, those sorts of things. You're not going to be able to form a full sentence at threshold. So it gives you a bit of an idea. When we go above that, that's when we're going into these sort of indiscrete zones, whether they're VO2 max or neuromuscular or anaerobic. It's kind of hard to define from the track metrics. It's going to be defined by your training structure. Usually you're talking about 100% of your heart rate, and you know, you kind of don't really see anything else. Rest times usually 1-to-1. So if you're going for a minute on, it's a minute off, 20 seconds on, 20 seconds off, that sort of thing. It's very time duration sensitive. So, you know, if it's going to be a 20-second effort, it's going to be 20-second peak effort. If it's 1 minute, it's going to be 1 minute peak effort. You'll rarely do a minute at threshold, because, you know, it's not going to end up being any of these things. So it is down a huge amount to the sort of the strategy of the coach, how they're going to structure sessions above threshold, whether they want to be working on some sort of anaerobic tolerance, your VO2 development, or a neuromuscular development. And these are all things that are worth working on. But again, they don't require a huge amount of effort because they're not structural. They're mostly neural and chemical in nature. So a small amount of training of these zones can go a huge way, but they are extremely fatiguing. And they take a huge amount of toll on the neuromuscular system. So doing too many of these sessions will wear you down very fast. You'll only really start to see improvements in these areas when you're working at 90% plus of your capacity. And if you're anyway fatigued, you're going to struggle to get to 90%. So doing these tired is pretty much pointless, because they're just going to end up being something else. So these are the types of sessions that you need to be quite fresh. They need to be done for very short periods of time so that you're repeatedly able to kind of hit the targets, because if you're not hitting your targets, they're not actually working on your maximum effort capacities. So it is really designed for that max sort of capacity and max ability. And it's things like short bursts and sprints. And again, for using that talk test, you're pretty much grunting or making noises at this point. You shouldn't be. If you're truly at VO2 max, you should be able to hear your breathing and nothing else pretty much. So then we look at some other sessions which don't really involve zones, but they're obviously different training types. So you can obviously have technical sessions which are working on drills, speed work, and actual practice around your racing. For triathletes is things like, you know, transition, racking bikes and putting shoes on. You know, they're sessions that are also training types that are very valuable, but they don't require, you know, the training zones to actually use. And then you've got things like tactical sessions where you're looking at pacing, race simulation, fuel testing, and equipment, etc. Those are something that you might want to use zones for, because if you're trying to do pacing strategy, for example, you're going to need to know what sort of pace that you're actually trying to practice and what the purpose of that session is. And a lot of the time it's something like fuel testing or race simulation, where you're just trying to get familiar with the effort that you're going to have to use, because the one piece about heart rate that becomes unreliable outside of training is that when you get into a racing environment, you're going to be excited, you're going to have nerves, and your heart rate will be elevated. So what you get used to in training isn't going to be as accurate, especially in short races. So being able to do these race simulations where you start to sort of learn and feel your zones becomes a little bit more important. But you certainly don't want to be training with that, because then you lose your consistency. So when it comes to putting it all together and putting together your training zones, it really all depends. You've got to keep it simple, because when it's simple, then it's something that you can track, it's something you can trace, and it's something you can evaluate. And when you can go back and evaluate things, you're going to be able to make educated decisions on where your training is going to go, and you're going to be able to assess where it is. And building that profile is something that I put huge emphasis on with any of the athletes I work with. I'll spend at least a month looking at different tests, different types of test training training sessions that all give me more accuracy around the detail of their zones, so I can make sure that they're really, really well established, and I can start to really tease out the strengths and weaknesses. And when you keep it simple, it makes it a lot easier to review. It's always easier to add complexity later on than it is at the start. And what I see in a lot of people, especially when they've had a failed program, is usually a case of that there's been a huge amount of variation and variety early on, and it makes it extremely hard to track what's worked and what hasn't. You know, if you can't go back to last month and assess your training because it's been totally different every day, then you're going to have a huge amount of issues with sort of restructuring and making a plan moving forward. Second tip, make sure to build endurance first. Most of us are fast enough to run very, very, very good race times, but we actually drop off our speed. You know, an Ironman isn't really about our top speed, it's about how much we slow down. And this applies to most events past about a 100-meter sprint, to be honest. So a lot of people spend a huge amount of time building speed and putting emphasis on speed, when in actual fact that what they're really lacking is the endurance to maintain good speed. The only time I would recommend doing a lot of speed work is if there's sort of a neuromuscular element to it, where perhaps you start to get cramp or break down at race pace. So you need a certain amount of exposure there to actually become conditioned to race pace. But generally speaking, build endurance, then worry about speed. You'll nearly always go faster when you get fitter anyway. That 80-20 principle is pretty much gold nowadays. 80% is below threshold, that 20% is above. If you lay out your training in that way and you recover on a regular basis, you're going to see reasonable progress. And it's really only when you're trying to get specific to your race event do you need to start looking at more complex approach. Make sure to keep logs. It's all well and good having your zones, but if you're not actually recording your sessions and recording with something that's easy to review, then it's largely pointless. Something like Training Peaks is fantastic because you can actually look back at the volume of your training sessions and see the breakdown of where you've done a certain amount of intensity. And your intensity distribution is really what's key in training and where you place emphasis. And that should kind of shift across the season. So you do need to make a log. It can be automatic. You don't have to sit and write down every session you've done, but certainly being able to upload from your watch or your computer and logging that over a long period of time gives you a huge amount to work with. Make a plan as well. You know, again, a lot of the mistakes people run into when they're working with their training zones is they've never had a plan to begin with. So they start getting very easily teased by other training methods that they suddenly think might be, you know, something interesting, and they get distracted by things that are shiny. And you can start very easily doing the wrong things at the wrong time. It's very easy to work back from an event and look at what the actual components of having a successful race are and work backwards, so that the farther away you are from the event, the less event specific you can be. And then the closer to the event, the more event specific you can be. So make a plan. That can be probably one of the biggest impacts on any sort of training program, but you can really only plan once you've got training zones to work with. Seventh tip is make sure to test. Okay, you can't just sit and expect to your sort of zones to just do their own thing. You do need to check them again. You can actually see shifts in zones where your threshold shifts, but your actual output doesn't, especially if you're working a huge amount above threshold. You can start to produce lactate earlier on because you're becoming more glycolytic. So your thresholds can shift and your actual performance can shift. So it is important to actually test to give yourself that benchmark. And once you've tested, then it's very easy to dictate and lay out your zones. But without some sort of baseline to actually assess yourself, it's going to be very, very difficult. And then the eighth thing I would say is, you know, if you're struggling with these things, use a coach. I mean, that is literally what the purpose of a coach is, to sort of make stepping stones and help you to, I guess, not learn by mistakes and to fast track your process. And the vast majority of people, you know, there's not a huge amount of different types of athletes, and it can be very easy for an experienced coach to be able to identify where someone's strengths and weaknesses are because they've seen, you know, 200 or 300. And unfortunately nowadays there's a huge amount on the internet where you can just pick something up ever so slightly different to the way it's written, and all of a sudden you're confused. Whereas coaches with proper training, you know, they know what the numbers mean and they know how to work with them. And like I said, you know, being able to dip into your zones and assess them accurately and structure them accurately is probably one of the most important things you can do in your training. And it's a service I offer on its own purely because it's so important, and being able to do multiple tests and to actually coordinate the information to be able to put together an accurate plan it just makes such a huge difference that I would say that that's probably one of the biggest sort of presents you can give yourself. If you're going to be working hard, it's definitely worth doing. Thank you very much for sitting through the information around zones. I have a lot of other information on both the website and Instagram, YouTube, and everything else, and there are the handles there for them. If anyone has any questions, and I have quite a few haven't come through the chat now, so I'm going to go through any questions now, and I've had a few sent in from during the week, but if you have any, just throw them into the chat now, and I'll try and get through as many as I can in the next sort of 10 to 15 minutes. So first question I have is around maffetone training. So if anyone's using maffetone training, maffetone is a bit of a sort of a rogue, not necessarily rogue, but it's an alternate sort of zone structure. And it takes a bit of an arbitrary calculation to find very sort of, what's the word? They're almost very definite aerobic zones. They're underestimated, so you're almost 100% going to be working aerobically. Now, that's probably a good thing, because most people will benefit from a lot more aerobic training, and a lot of people rely too much on intensity. So I think maffetone works because it underestimates things. It almost kind of guarantees you're working aerobically. So it's good for that. But I think it's pretty, I don't know, it doesn't really do much as soon as you go over threshold, and it doesn't really give you a threshold. So it lacks a huge amount of detail. So if you're in a base period where you're just trying to build aerobic capacity, I think maffetone is probably pretty good. But as soon as you go over that, then it becomes very limited very, very quickly. A question from Francine. If coming back after a month of layoff, how should you spend your zone 2 as in weeks? So how many weeks on the plan should you spend doing endurance work? To be honest, the more time you can spend in zone 2 building endurance, the better. And you can never do too much endurance work. So I mean, the base period for most athletes is 8 to, minimum of 8 weeks really, to see good positive changes there. So I would never really leave zone 2 work. When I get into race season, yes, I might try and introduce a lot more race specific sessions and a lot more intensity, but there'll always be zone 2 work there, because the more aerobic you can be, the better. So when you're coming back from a layoff, you don't really need high intensity. So you should just start with mostly zone 2 and recovery work, and just build it up, put down a layer, a layer of fitness, a layer of sort of conditioning so that you don't get injured as well. And then gradually add intensity when you need it. People add intensity far too earlier than they actually need it. You really only need 3-4 weeks worth of intensity to start seeing the benefits from it. But zone 2 work you can be doing all year round and really sort of stacking up the adaptations from it. Eddie asks, is there a difference between heart rate zones for running and cycling? Yes, there's a lot less muscle being used when you're on the bike. So generally cycling zones will be a little bit lower than running zones. It can be anywhere between 5 and 10 beats in heart rate. But generally, yes, there is a little bit lower for cycling. And you'll see if you're using something like Training Peaks, they'll actually give you separate zone tables for running, cycling, swimming, and all the rest. But yeah, it's definitely something that you should check. And also indoor and outdoor can be different. So running heart rate and cycling heart rate indoor sometimes can be either higher or lower. Heat will make a big difference there. So it is something just worth checking. Do training zones especially hard to determine fueling requirements? If not, is it training zones do sort of determine fueling requirements. Certainly around threshold, there'll be a lot more demand for carbohydrate, without a doubt. Generally lower intensity stuff, there's not quite as much pressure on carbohydrate. There will be a bit more from fat, but you also, if you're doing a huge amount of threshold work, can become quite poor at burning fat, and you'll start favoring fuel even at aerobic intensity. So I would, depends on the duration of the event as well. If you're doing a very long duration zone 2 ride, you're definitely going to need fuel, and it's going to need to be in the form of carbohydrate. But shorter sessions don't require nearly as much fuel. threshold work or efforts above threshold will need a huge amount of carbohydrates. So especially if you're doing VO2 or anaerobic work or any sort of threshold training, make sure that you're well fueled going into those sessions, because if you're not, you'll actually just see a reduction in power. You won't really see the benefits from it. Should aerobic training generally feel uncomfortably slow? It can do, yeah, especially for runners. It can be really, really painfully slow and painfully boring. And that's sometimes a good sign. I always tell people when they're signing up for one of my kind of base endurance programs to be prepared to be bored for the first sort of portion of the training. You will have to, especially if you've not done enough or haven't become conditioned to aerobic training, it takes a while to build back up the speed. But the beauty of training slow initially is that you'll become more efficient. You'll teach the body how to do less and move faster. So you'll start seeing your pace increasing quite gradually, but your heart rate and everything else won't be increasing. And that's a really, really good sign that your actual running ability is becoming a lot more efficient and your exercise economy is improving. So actually training slow to begin with is no harm. It's a little bit boring, and it might be a case of that you're shuffling or walking between runs, but it is worthwhile, you know, being really diligent and actually forcing yourself to go that slow. And especially if you're very, very, you know, new to running in particular, you might find yourself walking a lot more than running. And if you're going uphill as well, and that's fine, because you're still creating that physiological stress. You're still going to get good adaptation from that. So there's nothing wrong with going slow if you're in your heart rate zone. And again, that's where using pace becomes a little bit limited, because you might be well out of zone and working on something that you don't really want. What's the highest heart rate max you've seen? Yeah, again, the calculations for heart rate max aren't great. And their best fit curve. So the whole 220 minus your age, if I did that, it wouldn't give me my max heart rate. Highest heart rate I've seen, well, if somebody's in some sort of cardiac arrest, they can go well past 200. But generally speaking, I think in a young athlete around their 20s, you will see 205, 206 quite regularly. I'm in my 30s and I'll see 194 is probably the highest I've seen for me, and I shouldn't. So that calculation isn't super. It puts you in a ballpark. It's about 90% accurate, but don't rely on it, and certainly don't get stressed if it's not right. What else do I have? What sort of things can influence zones? Sort of mentioned it there. So heat in particular will throw your heart rate up very, very quickly and make a certain effort feel very, very difficult. So heat, dehydration, and fatigue would probably be the main ones. Discomfort and fueling will also be an issue. If you start to run out of fuel and you start to get uncomfortable, your heart rate will go up because you'll start getting a little bit more stressed, and heart rate will definitely reflect that. Why is your heart rate so high after taking time off? Well, generally speaking, when we lose a little bit of fitness, we lose efficiency at submaximal effort. So you might find that what used to be an effort that you could hold a pretty low heart rate for is all of a sudden 10, 15 beats higher. That's just because you've lost a little bit of efficiency. The chances are you've not necessarily lost your ability, and you've just lost that kind of, I guess, familiarity with that effort. So it usually comes back pretty quickly. Should you allow heart rate go into a new power zone if you know, or a new zone if you know you can manage the power? So I think this is a case of somebody who's set their trainer at maybe 300 watts, and normally that gives them a zone, you know, a heart rate of, I don't know, 150, and all of a sudden today they're at 160. Should they stay there? You've sort of got to ask the question yourself. Like, there's a little bit of wiggle room. If it goes maybe 5 beats above, it's not that big a deal. But if you're 20 beats above, then you've definitely transitioned into a new zone. And that can definitely happen if you're fatigued or dehydrated or whatever else. So if you've had a long day at work and you think you're going to set a PB and force it, you know, it's unlikely. So a lot of the time, especially in training, it's better just to notch back down the power a little bit, let your heart rate come back down into the desired zone, because that way you're not going to overtrain and you're going to be working on what you'd actually plan to work. Now, sometimes you get excited, you just want to push and have a hard session, and that's probably sometimes good for the head, but you just don't want it to happen every session. You don't want to blast through your desired zone, because very quickly your training starts to become something that it shouldn't be. Training for an ultra distance, 24-hour or multi-day, how much above zone 2 training is needed? Less than some other events. So obviously that is going to be very, very heavily aerobic in nature. So the vast majority of your training should be aerobic, but it's definitely worth doing some threshold work, because you're going to have instances where you're doing climbs and things, and at times where you're going to have more sort of muscular strain, and doing a little bit of high effort work there can help build strength. And it can help build resilience. You know, you're always going to be producing some lactate, so you do actually want your body to be used to getting some exposure to that and burning it. So do a little bit of high intensity work, but you know, it should definitely be, you know, under that sort of 20%. I would say, you know, you might push the sort of the ratio to maybe more like 90% easy, 10% hard, but it's still worth doing some. It's certainly not something that should be totally neglected, but it just isn't nearly as applicable to somebody's maybe doing a time trial or a 5K run. Is heart rate training applicable to swimming? Yes, it's just not particularly practical. The heart rate belts don't tend to pick up heart rate particularly well in water. The signals don't move through water very well. Some of the watches use optical sensors. Optical sensors aren't particularly accurate either. And the heart rate belt is always, the chest strap is always the most accurate. But again, the problem is contact with the skin. Even some of these swimming specific belts where they sort of stick to the skin still move far too much to pick up a good signal. So, you know, you're kind of reliant on looking at your watch when you're swimming to see your heart rate, which is next to impossible, and then getting a good signal, neither of which you're likely to get on a consistent basis. So while it would be fantastic to be able to see your heart rate in real time with perfect signal in swimming, it's just not practical. And it's the same with lactate. You know, there's plenty of swim coaches who are trying to stop guys at the end of the pool, take a quick lactate sample, and then tell them whether they're going too hard or too slow. And it's just not particularly practical in your regular session. So yeah, I'm not aware of any sensor that's accurate enough or gives a real-time reading to allow you to do swim sort of zones particularly well. When adding high zone work, is it better to have a dedicated session or add a few minutes into each workout? You can sort of do both. It's sort of time dependent. Typically, you don't want to stack your high intensity sessions, so you wouldn't want to be doing high intensity in every session. And especially if you're doing long duration training sessions, you know, you're probably creating too much fatigue to really get very good high intensity work. So I personally prefer to take that sort of polarized approach where I'm either working aerobically or working at high intensity, just because I can focus and sort of separate it, segregate it, and actually give it proper focus. But as you get closer to race season, you might want to mix it in. So especially something like a criterium racer will need to add a lot of high intensity work in with a lot of rest time to sort of promote recovery between efforts. So you can do both. That one depends, and you can be successful with both as well. What else do I guess? Do zones change with body weight? Not necessarily. So obviously, if you increase body weight, you're probably going to be increasing heat production and reducing heat dissipation. So that'll probably bring up your heart rates, and you're probably carrying more load, which means you're going to be working a little bit harder for whatever pace output you're doing. So your zones might shift because you're heavier, but weight on its own won't actually impact your zones. No. Just see, how do I get my heart rate back down during rest? So as I said, there is going to be a bit of a lag in heart rate. So if you've got 1 minute rest and it's you know, your training says that you need to be at 50% of heart rate, obviously it's going to take a minute or two to get back down to it. So you've got to kind of use common sense there. You know, if you're at rest, then drop your intensity right down. And if your heart rate doesn't get all the way back down, that's not really you know, going to be hugely critical to the session. But at the same time, if you're not seeing your heart rate drop, your efficiency is maybe not there. So sometimes that's, you know, the rate at which your heart rate comes back down is sometimes a good indication of efficiency, that you can go from working hard to working easy and your heart rate responds quickly. That's usually a pretty good sign. But sometimes when you're really tired, heart rate's going to be elevated. So it does become tricky to use heart rate at rest. So as long as you're, you know, being clued in, and if you're resting, you're actually resting, then you're going to be okay. What is the minimum amount of time that should be spent in zone 2 for a session to be making a benefit? Would 1 hour okay be on the turbo, or should be more 2 hour spin? This is actually something that's really heavily debated at the moment, and there's a lot of studies going on to see what sort of adaptation and stimulus comes from submaximal work. And there literally is the question of how much is, how easy is too easy and how much is enough. I will say that you probably don't need as much work indoors in terms of volume to be as effective as outdoors, because there's a more of a steady state, there's more consistent application of power, and the fatigue is going to be a little bit higher per hour than it would be outside when perhaps you're coasting down a hill or whatever. But in terms of actually saying how much is enough, that is very much dependent on the person. If somebody is totally unfit and hasn't trained at all, 30 minutes of zone 2 might be giving them enough of a stimulus to have an adaptation. Whereas if you're a pro athlete, you might be doing 30 hours a week to get any sort of improvement. It really does depend on the person, but there's no amount of time that's too little, because again, it's cumulative. So if you're only doing a 15-20 minute run twice a week and maybe an hour run the other day, it's what you do on average week to week and then month to month. And as long as there's a progression of volume from month to month, you're going to see a progression in fitness. So it is very much down to the individual how much is enough. But if you're progressing it conservatively but consistently, you'll get a fitness improvement. So it's not to say that you need to do a minimum of 1 hour or a minimum of 2 hours. It really does come down to the person, and really training history is going to be a big part there. And when I get somebody that starts working with me, I'll usually look at what their training history has been for the last month or two. And then I'll put them through a sort of very standardized month to see how they react to sessions. And that'll tell me, is an hour an endurance session, or is an hour actually becoming quite fatiguing for them? So generally speaking, if you find that your heart rate is drifting a huge amount or rising a huge amount without a corresponding increase in effort, then you're probably struggling for that duration. And it's only when things are dead stable can you say, okay, well, this isn't enough for me, I should add more. Is Garmin accurate? Is Garmin German threshold? Sorry, is Garmin thresholds accurate when they're on the watch? It suggests I have to change, even though I haven't done a hard 5K. Yeah, again, Garmin calculations are based on a sort of an algorithm that's, again, best fit curve. It's pretty accurate, but it's not 100% accurate. And it sort of takes your most recent hard sort of 20-minute effort and it does that calculation for you to give you zones. So it's not necessarily something you want to do, especially if you're in a base phase where you've been doing a huge amount of low intensity training. You might not have a recent hard effort, and it might automatically take the hardest effort you've done in the last little while and assume it's your threshold when it's not. It's just you haven't done a hard session. So I wouldn't pay a huge amount of attention to the numbers the Garmin spits out. I always input manually, and when I'm working with, I'll usually say, here are your zones that I've worked out based on the last month of your training. Put those into your Garmin and don't worry about what it's telling you. Is power the same indoors and outside? No, not quite. Power indoors, again, you're subject to a little bit more heat. You're not getting nearly as many breaks in the sort of the pedaling stroke. So it is a little bit different. Generally as well, if you're going uphill or on a turbo, you've got more consistent load on the power meter as well. So sometimes it makes it easier to hold a higher power. If you're on the flat, you get a lot more breaks in the pedal stroke, which can make it a little bit harder to keep a slightly higher power output. So no, they're not quite the same. And it is worth sometimes testing. If you've been indoors and you plan to do your training indoors, test indoors. But as soon as you transition to outside, it's usually worth doing a test outside as well. If using 80-20, what's the target zone for long distance events? It depends on the event. If it's an hour, it's probably going to be close to that threshold effort. If it's multiple hours, then it's going to be closer to that zone 2 effort. And that really depends on the length of event. Long distance event, it's a bit vague. Like, is it 40K or is it 100K? Because they'd be kind of different. Usually, once you kind of go over the 2 hour mark, you're going to be significantly below threshold effort, but only you can kind of work out what that sustainable effort for that duration is. And generally, if you can kind of hold it for 2 hours, it's probably going to be more down to fueling. Okay, for a marathon. For a marathon, sub-threshold, probably somewhere towards the upper end of zone 3 would be appropriate for a marathon. But again, what actual speed that ends up being depends on how much sort of progress and efficiency you've built in racing. You'll probably see your heart rate rise up to what it would be at threshold, and the last hour you're probably going to lift it up to whatever threshold is. But I certainly wouldn't go off at threshold. Like some of the top elite guys, they can pretty much sit at threshold all day because they've trained for that. But you certainly wouldn't want to start a marathon at threshold. I would say starting at kind of upper zone 3 and then building towards the latter half and go for a negative split is the most effective way to do it. But that's something you should kind of work out in training. You know, what's your stable pace, what you know you can hold for long periods of time, and it becomes a fueling effort. And really with the marathon, what you're trying to do is kind of put yourself in a position to have that negative split. So that's, again, kind of highly dependent, to give you an accurate answer on that. How often should you test? This is actually a very good question. I'm sorry I actually didn't cover it because it is a good question. This kind of depends a little bit. If you're doing a really accurate lab test, I would say probably 2 or 3 times a year, just to make sure that you are actually, you know, getting another assessment and making it accurate. But if you're using something like a field test, you can be doing it every other month or every month. A new or a beginner athlete will tend to have quite rapid shifts in their fitness and quite rapid shifts in their zones. So it is worth testing a little bit more regularly, but probably less substantially. So using, you know, just kind of using test sessions rather than maximal tests. But somebody who's a little bit more advanced is probably going to need a couple of weeks, maybe a month or 2 before you're going to see any really significant change. So with most of the guys I work with, if they're relatively well trained, I might test them every 2 months. But if it's a complete beginner, I might be testing them with some form of session every week, just to make sure that I'm keeping up with that sort of newbie fitness or that break-in fitness that they're getting. Oh, this is a good one. My heart rate seems to be lower when I'm testing, but I can't really go much harder. Any ideas why my heart rates are lower when I'm feeling well rested and everything? Yes, this actually probably is a question that relates to those shifts in heart rate. So I'll use myself, for example. Years ago when I was, or a couple of years ago when I was starting off into endurance, I wouldn't have been particularly efficient, and my threshold heart rate might have been 185, and I mightn't have been able to hold a particularly high pace or a particularly good amount of power. Whereas now, significant improvement in pace, significant improvement in power, but all of a sudden when I'm testing, I can't really go above a heart rate of 175. So my heart rate's, I've probably become a lot more efficient. My heart doesn't need to pump that hard anymore. And my threshold has actually moved down a little bit on my heart rate range. So that does happen where your heart rate threshold can actually shift up and down. So that's where those heart rate maximum calculations aren't particularly accurate, because just because you have a maximum heart rate of 190 and, you know, the recommendation is that your threshold is maybe 90%, it might not be. Your threshold might be at 80% or 85% of maximum. It's a little bit different for everyone, and does shift depending on what type of work you do. If you're doing a huge amount of glycolytic work, you're going to become glycolytic a lot earlier. You're going to hit threshold a lot earlier, but you can still have a huge power output. It's just you're more glycolytic. So someone like a track sprinter, for example, will hit threshold very early, or generally quite low down in their heart rate, but they'll sit above threshold for a long period of time, and they'll also be able to have huge power outputs well above the sort of typical aerobic type athlete, because they're built for sprinting. They're built to have fast production of energy, but they're also not training to maintain it for a huge amount of time. So again, it does kind of shift depending on what type of work you're doing. Let's see, I have time for one more question. What have I got? Okay, this is a runner, I'm presuming. When I go uphill, my heart rate goes up. Is that okay? You're going uphill, so you are actually producing more power. You might be slowing down, but actually when it comes to power and effort, your effort has increased. So more muscle, more lactate, different physiological process. I would actually slow down. And there's some great stories of Norwegian distance runners who are some, you know, fantastic endurance athletes, not distance runners, cross-country skiers, who slow down dramatically going uphill in training. And the question is why? It's because they're staying in zone. They are actually working hard. They're just not going as fast. And sometimes when you're going uphill, because you slow down, you think that, you know, you're not actually working as hard, but you are. You can be working a lot harder. It's just you're not going as fast because now you're climbing as well as moving forward. So it is important, if you see your heart rate going up and it is a training session, to rein it back in, slow down, because when you're sitting in those zones, you're still getting those sort of physiological adaptations that you've planned for. If you're just trying to keep on pace, that's again where we talk about pace being a sort of a poor metric, because it's easily influenced. As soon as you try to run uphill, the pace will be reduced. Doesn't mean you're working any less hard. Okay, I think that's probably all I've got time for. If there's any more questions, now's your chance. No, okay. Thank you very much for joining, everyone. Like I said, if you are interested in some more of these talks, I'm hopefully going to be doing a little bit of a series on some different topics. So make sure to sign up for the newsletter because you'll get first dibs on them. Unfortunately, there's a little bit of a capacity on these. And also make sure to follow on Instagram because they do kind of put a few bits and bobs out there. And if anyone is interested in getting some help with any of your training or coaching, then just check out the website and you can see all of the options there as well. Hope everyone enjoyed that. And thanks once again for sitting through. Enjoy the rest of your weekend.